Hello, everyone. Today we have a new topic to discuss, which is the elements of a short story. We're going to use these elements to dissect a short story and to further understand the different situation that's happening in a short story. So let's get started. So the first element that we're going to talk about is the characters. So we have the different types of character. The first one is the stock or a stereotype characters. So these are characters that require less details for they are very well known and they are very much everybody is familiar with them. So the best example for this is Lola Bashang. So whenever we hear the term Lola Bashang, the first thing that pops up onto our mind is an old lady holding a book, okay, sitting on a rocking chair, and the one that has a cloth over her shoulder, okay, and used to tell stories to children. So that is a stock character. Less details are required for them because they are very well known. Another example is Spider-Man, Superman, Batman, because these characters are very well known to everyone. We are not going to discuss their powers because once you hear their name, you already know what powers they already possess. Okay? The next one is hero, heroine versus villain. So hero is a good guy or male leading character, while heroine is a good female character. So hero or heroine are always good. Okay, they are always good. While villain, on the other hand, are always the bad guy or the antagonist in the story. Okay, the main difference of hero and heroine with protagonist is that hero and heroine are always good. They never go on the dark side. Okay, and the same difference pops up to villain versus antagonist. Antagonists sometimes could do some good, but they end up to be the cause of the problem in the story. However, the villain is always the bad guy who always make the problem or the conflict in the story. So we have protagonist versus antagonist. So whenever we hear characters in a short story, we are always asked to identify the protagonist or antagonist. So when we hear the term protagonist, they are considered the hero of the story. The protagonist is the center of the story. It is him or her who will experience whatever conflict would pop up in a particular story. On the other hand, when we say antagonist, it might be the same character, meaning the same leading character who might cause the conflict, or it might be other character who might cause the conflict in the story. So meaning antagonist is the source of the conflict to our protagonist. Okay? So sometimes, as I said, the protagonist is also an antagonist of the story. So one best example for that is The Telltale Heart by Edgar Allan Poe, whereas the main character or the speaker in the story is actually the antagonist himself. Okay? If you want to know more about this short story, I will appreciate your effort very much by reading The Telltale Heart by Edgar Allan Poe. So next we have the setting. So the first thing that would pop up to our mind when we say setting is the time and place. So it is important for a reader to determine the time and place, for it will give them the background of why people are acting this way. Okay, what kind of culture, what kind of customs or tradition do this group of people have during that time and in particular area? For example, if you're going to compare the actions of the male and female today in our society versus the actions that they had during the Spanish era, there is a great difference between how male and female treat each other. Today, it's okay to hug anyone regardless of their gender. But during the Spanish era, it's a big no-no for a female to hug a male, especially if they don't have any blood relation. It's only okay to hug, it's only okay for a man to hug a woman or otherwise, um, if they are siblings. Okay, so that's how important time and place is, because it also determines the kind of custom or actions the characters we have in the story. So sometimes the setting of the story is implied from the actions and from the descriptions to where the character is. Okay, so sometimes it's not explicitly mentioned in the story about the time and place. So next we got the most important part, which is the plot. So the plot is the sequence of events in the story. So we have 5 parts of plot. The first one is the exposition or the introduction. So normally in the introduction or exposition, this is where we could first see who the major character is, and of course, the time and place or the setting. Okay, so it would normally give us a happy start, okay, a fresh start, okay, how the character is being raised by his or her parents. But sometimes there are writers who try to use what we call the in medias res in order to start their story. When we say medias res, it means in the middle of things. So instead of starting it with an introduction, the first paragraph that you would read in the story is actually the middle of the story. Now, the main reason for them is to make their readers wondering why such situation happened. And in order for them to answer their queries about why is this the first thing to happen in the story, they are required to read the entire passage, the entire story, in order to answer their question. Okay, so it's like in a horror film, like at the onset of the movie, there's a monster or there's a ghost killing a person, and you as an audience of that particular movie, you're wondering what is the reason why such ghost is killing other people. So you're wondering that kind of action. And then we go to the rising action. When we say the rising action, it propels the reader or the audience to the arising conflict in the story. So basically, when we say rising action, this is where the conflict starts to unravel. And then when we go to climax, this is actually the peak of the story. So in the climax, it is where the character tries to create a solution to the ongoing problem. Okay? It's a turning point for the character, what options to choose in order to solve the problem. Okay? It's the highest point. That's why, as you see in our um, diagram, climax is the highest point. It's like the peak of the mountain. Okay? Then after climax, we got the falling action. So when we have the falling action, it is the part where possible options or solutions arose for the character to resolve the issue. So again, the rising action is where the conflict starts to unravel. And then the climax is the highest point of the story, meaning it is the turning point. Or in our modern time, we could call it the exciting part of the story. And then once the character chose the action in order to resolve the conflict, we will now move to the falling action. In the falling action, this is what would be the outcome after choosing a possible solution for the conflict. Okay? And after that, since we already knew the outcome under falling action, we would now proceed to the denouement or the resolution of the story. Denouement would further determine whether the character would become happy with the solution he or she provided for the conflict, or it would further make his or her life miserable. Okay, that's why in the denouement, it actually determines a short story, whether it's a tragedy or a comedy. So when we say a comedic short story, meaning the short story ends happily. Okay, normally we hear it in fairy tales, like they live happily ever after. So if the story ends that way, then we can consider that the story is a comedy. But when we say there's a tragic ending, or an important character died at the end of the story, or the conflict of our main character is left unresolved, then we can consider that the short story falls under tragedy. It has a sad ending. So that's the difference between comedy and tragedy. Normally, we can only tell it by the end of the story. So after the plot, we have conflict. So we have two major types of conflict, the internal conflict and the external conflict. Under internal conflict, there's only one. So we have man versus himself. So it's a type of conflict that takes place inside the character's mind. So man versus self, conflict usually involves the main character's inner struggle with self-doubts, a moral dilemma, or their own nature. So to simply put, man versus himself is actually an ongoing problem within the character's mind. Okay, for example, the only conflict that you have to yourself is a low self-esteem. Okay, so it's a struggle within you. The people around you has nothing to do with the struggle going on with your life. Okay, one best short story, one best example is again the Telltale Heart. Okay, it's an internal struggle of the character that he or she needs to resolve. So after man versus conflict, let's move man versus himself, I should say. Let's now move on to the external conflict. So we have first the man versus man. By the name of this conflict, you can easily determine that man versus man is a person versus the other person. This is a type of conflict where two characters are in direct opposition to each other. You can also consider the characters of hero or heroine versus villain. The driving force of the conflict is how these two interact and how the antagonist keeps the main character from achieving their goals. So the main function of the antagonist is to hinder our protagonist in achieving whatever goals he or she has in the story. For example, in the picture, you can already determine who the characters are. So the one on the left side is Batman, then the other man is Joker. So you know for sure that there is an ongoing conflict between man and Batman. So Batman's function is to hinder Joker from doing evil things. So it's like Batman is our hero and Joker is our villain. But in order for Joker to continue doing whatever crime he wants to do, he needs to eliminate Batman first. Okay, that's why these two characters are one of the best examples for man versus man conflict. So next we have another conflict, which is man versus nature. As the term suggests, nature means anything that surrounds us, especially the plants, mountains, rivers, and anything. So the protagonist is hindered by or fighting against natural forces like weather, animals, or climate change. So the best example I found is the man and the man and the sea. So it's a struggle of the main character during the time when he was left alone in the sea. So if you want to know more about the story of Ernest Hemingway, you can definitely read this story. Okay? So again, when we say man versus nature, it's either the man is battling against the weather, battling against the animal, or climate change. So for a man battling against the animal, one best example is probably the story of, the adventure of Hercules. Although it's not really animal, but they are mythical creatures such as Hydra, the bull, okay, the goat, and so on. Okay. Next, we have man versus society. So when you hear the term society, what we're battling for is actually we're fighting against the government. But we're not fighting the government to make the government fall. But what we're after is we are correcting the incorrect way of leading or managing the government. Another example of man versus society is when we fight against racism and abuses in the society. Okay, one best example or two of the best examples I found is actually the Noli Me Tangere and El Filibusterismo. Both are written by our national hero, Dr. Jose Rizal. So both books are tackling about the abuses that Filipinos during the Spanish era are experiencing. Okay? So that is these two are really the best example for man versus society. For they talk about racism, they talk about inequality. All right, like women or the poor people are not allowed to study unless they have money to pay for it. Okay, so that is just the tip of an iceberg for this story. But if you want to know more about the different abuses in the society, I very much appreciate it if you could go back and reread Noli Me Tangere and El Filibusterismo. Then the last conflict that we have is man versus supernatural being. So as we hear the term supernatural being, it definitely talks about a powerful person. So meaning a person with power. It's not only the gods or the goddesses, but it could also refer to deities, to the spirits of the nature, and so on. So one best example that I found is the story of Perseus. So Perseus battled Medusa, and Medusa is a powerful being who would turn a human into stone once you gaze onto her eyes. Okay, so Perseus is just, although Perseus is a demigod, but he cannot do it himself without the help of other gods. Okay. Normally, the different short stories about man versus supernatural being are the common conflict we could find in Greek mythology and Roman mythology. So these are the different types of conflict. We got for internal conflict, man versus himself. For external conflict, man versus nature, man versus society, and man versus supernatural being. Now, we also have what we call the point of view or punto de vista. It refers on how the story is being narrated. We only have two types of point of view. So first is the first person point of view, and the second is the third person point of view. You can easily determine the point of view in the story if the narrator starts using he or she for the third person point of view, or the pronoun I for the first person point of view. For example, if the narrator said, I took the challenge. So that technically that is a first person point of view, meaning the narrator is part of the story. But when we say he took the challenge for himself, definitely with the use of he, we can easily say that this is a third person point of view, meaning the narrator is just an observant of the character's action. Okay, so there we have two types of third person point of view. One is third person limited, and the other one is third person omniscient. So on the first part, which is the third person limited, by looking at the term limited, meaning the knowledge of the narrator in regards to the situation of the story is limited to his or her observation. So that means the focus of the narrator is only the protagonist and some parts of the antagonist. The narrator does not have any knowledge of what's going on the minds of the characters. It's only the external situation the narrator has knowledge about. Okay. And then the second one, which is the third person omniscient, from the term omniscient, the narrator is full aware of the character's action, the character's thought, and the character's plan. So everything the character has within himself and outside himself, it is, the narrator is fully knowledgeable of it. Okay? So the last is the theme. The theme is the general message or central idea and the controlling topic of the story, which the author wanted to get across to various audiences. So meaning the theme could make other audience relate to the story. Okay, the theme what the theme is what makes the story relatable to others. Okay, in order to identify the theme of the story, the reader should learn how to think big. Okay, you need to think bigger about the situation, about what's happening in the story. You may ask yourself, what is the message, or what message is the author trying to say about the world in which we live in? So after reading the story, you must question yourself, how is this story relevant to the situation we have today? For example, the Noli Me Tangere and El Filibusterismo. What is the central idea that these two novels wanted to tell not only the Filipinos, but other people around the globe? And what message can we get from those two novels that we can relate to? Then the second question that you might ask yourself, what is the story telling me about how life works or how people behave? So probably the story might open up your mind that people are not all people are the same. People really are different from each other, and you must accept differences. You must accept um, the shortcomings of other people, and you must understand why people fail, why people succeed. So these are just two of the questions that you might ask yourself in order to identify the central idea or the general message of the story. Okay? So, as a reminder, it is best appreciated if you could remember these elements, as these are very useful in dissecting and understanding short stories in your future readings. So, with that, I would end the lesson, and thank you so much for listening. Have a great day, everyone, and always have fun learning. Goodbye for now.